Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. I'm Thomas Boersma, project manager at Solarplaza, and I welcome you to today's webinar on floating solar PV, a sea of opportunities. Today we'll have a webinar with Simon Gazdowics, solar consultant at Multiconsult. He will give us a state of the current market, an overview of key technologies and systems available in the market, and in the end he will take us through the latest innovations on floating solar PV, hydro-connected solar, hybrids, offshore solar, and so on. So before we do that, I want to give you a short introduction, take you through our upcoming events, take you through our work on floating solar, some practical details for today's webinar, and then we'll go to Simon's presentation. And in the end, we'll have a Q&A to answer all your questions. So our upcoming events, next week we'll start off with the second series of Future Grid Labs, this year on hydrogen, circularity, customer centricity. The Future Grid Labs was also where our work on floating solar started last year with a sold-out Future Grid Lab on floating solar in December. If you're interested in one of these topics, please go to www.thefuturegrid.com, check out the programs, and there will be the 17th, the 24th, and the 27th of May this year. Besides that, we have upcoming solar market parity events, one in Italy, one in Portugal. They will touch upon floating solar as well, but on a side. Besides that, we'll go into subsidy-free solar in more detail, market mechanisms, PPAs, and so on. For more information, please check out those websites as well, or drop us an email for more information. Last but not least, the Solar Future Netherlands, our flagship event here in our home country, the 11th edition in Utrecht. Also here we'll touch upon floating solar in one session. It will be about the Dutch market, and of course that's a hot market for floating solar as well. And then our work on floating solar, that's why we're here today. This is a graph we posted in January 2019, our top 100 floating solar plants around the world. As you may see, Japan, China, South Korea, activity was mostly in Asia, still is the majority of the market, of course, but as you see by these headlines, activity starts in Europe and the US as well, and that's also why we wanted to host a global floating solar conference, focusing on developments around the globe on floating solar, giving you a state of the market, state of the technology, but also going in depth on challenges like environmental impact. What does it do to the water, and what does the water do to the solar panels? What is the potential of hybrids with hydro dams? What is the potential for offshore solar? What is the efficiency gains of the cooling effect of the waters? These kind of questions we'll answer in one full conference day. And besides that, we'll also visit the day before the conference an actual floating solar plant. So if you've never seen one, this is a nice opportunity for you to get a bit more hands-on practice here. And in the run-up to that event, we'll do today's webinar. For today's webinar, we'll have some practical details. If there are any technical issues, please use the chat box. We'll try to help you there. For questions, please feel free to ask questions throughout the whole presentation. If something is unclear, we'll do a Q&A in the end and answer all your questions then. The biggest question always is, will the recordings be available? Yes, we'll send out the recordings by the end of this week, so you can rewatch the webinar. The slides are also available. You can actually already download them in the handout section of your software. So on the right side of your screen, you'll find a PDF file with today's slides. Then it's a pleasure to introduce Simon Gazdowics, solar consultant at Multiconsult. He will give today's presentation. So Simon, I'm gonna unmute you and hand over control to you. But before we go to your presentation, I would like to launch a poll. So just to see of the people in the room today what they're most interested in. So here is the poll. So of what floating solar topic is most interested to the audience? Is that the market development, the available systems and specifications? Is it the environmental impact? Are the innovations, or are you just interested in all of the above? So the poll is open now, and the results should come in. Simon, are you already unmuted?
Yes.
Yes.
You can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. So what do you expect? What would be the topic most of interest to the audience? What would you say?
I would think perhaps the available systems and specifications and the innovations, mainly because market developments, I think, are pretty easily accessible. The World Bank recently released a rather big and comprehensive report on this, which I referred to a few times in this presentation. So I think those two are probably the biggest.
All right, then.
And hopefully,
so, well, it's mostly all of the above, so that's good to see. People are very interested in everything with floating solar and market developments. And I think it's nice that you already referred that there's a lot of work available there. Also, we have some upcoming content with Solarplaza on this, so that's nice to see. And I think all of the above is also a good sign for the conference, because we'll touch upon all of the above. And yeah, of course, you're going to do a state of the market today as well, overview of key technologies and the latest innovations. So it's a pleasure, and good luck with the presentation.
Excellent. Well, first of all, thank you for the introduction and for the opportunity to present. As you mentioned, my name's Simon Gazdowics. I'm one of the consultants at Multiconsult, and this presentation is on more or less our perspective on the state of the industry. I wanted to start with a quick introduction on the company and Multiconsult and what we do. Just briefly, we're a multidisciplinary group of consulting engineers. I work for the solar section, but we also have wind sections, the hydro section, which is probably Norway's key strength, power system section, and then a group of economists that help us with financial analysis and tender management and things like that. And essentially, our sort of key value is working together to deliver projects like tendering saltwater projects for floating solar, as you can see sort of in the top corner here in the Seychelles, and things like feasibility studies for hybrid solar hydropower plant projects like you see in the bottom. That one's for Liberia. I'll get into those a little bit later on. But essentially, this is our offering for the ground-mounted systems, and we're working to tailor it also for floating solar projects, as we're seeing the market starting to sort of pick up steam. And I've been lucky enough to work on all the projects that have come through our door so far, which has been really exciting and a lot of fun. But without any further ado, I'll jump into it. I've got some 52 slides or so to get through, and haven't managed to make it in any of my rehearsals. So apologies if I skip over things. Make sure you add any of your questions to the chat box. So at the start, the concept, what is floating solar? The short answer is it's really not that different from the ground-mounted systems. The topology of the plants is generally the same, and the big difference sort of comes with the substructure. Instead of a tracking or fixed system that mounts on the ground, you've got a floating substructure that floats on the water surface and is sort of held in place by this anchoring and mooring system. The floaters provide additional buoyancy to the system, additional flexibility to the waves, and need to support the system for the standard lifetime. These are still expected up to 25 years. The mooring system's in place to stop the plant from just floating around under the impact of the wind and the tides and the waves. It also needs to take into account any fluctuations in the water levels, which can be very significant for things like hydropower reservoirs. Modules, the consensus is that they should have more stringent requirements, but essentially a lot of the high quality modules from today, we believe, are high enough quality to survive in these sorts of environments. Modules in higher humidity and closer to the water can often be a bit more susceptible to things like PID, and if there's an issue with encapsulation, it's going to get exploited a bit quicker than on the land. But essentially, high quality modules today are pretty resistant to both of these factors, and also tend to be quite good on the water surface. Inverters thus far have usually been found onshore next to the plants, but for larger systems, as we're starting to see installed and are sort of expected into the future, we're starting to see those are also going to need to be mounted out on the water by the floating system, generally on their own pontoons, and and central inverters are, I guess, the more dominant sort of choice in that section, just because they're a little bit easier than putting a lot of string inverters at the end of these floating strings. What are the main advantages? Why do people bother with this? Well, you can easily Google this and you'll get a whole big list of the real potential advantages, but essentially I've dumbed them down into three lists, three segments. Let's say the first one being that they save space on the land and the associated costs. And secondly is the reduced grid connection costs if you manage to find water bodies that are in proximity to an existing grid connection. Both of these manage to offset the additional costs of the plant and sort of make it a lot more viable. Secondly, and this is the one you probably hear touted most, is the better performance of the modules due to the cooling effect of the water. And whilst it seems that this is definitely true, the degree to which it is the case is still sort of up in the air. The jury is out on that one. And it also depends a lot on the design. As you'll see a little bit later on, some of the designs facilitate a lot of heat transfer between the modules and the water, whereas other floating solutions act very much as a barrier and thus might not benefit that much at all from the cooling effect. And in there's also a lot of these tertiary benefits, things like limited evaporation of the water, reduction in algae growth. But with things like that, it's important to keep a perspective on how much of the water body is covered. Some of these reservoirs are extremely large, and if you cover 0.1%, you're not going to get a lot of reduced evaporation. And once again, and also it's dependent on the design. Some of them are very open and allow a lot of sunlight to pass through and evaporation to come back out. Yeah. So it's one of those depends things. The market evolution, you can see that the market sort of officially kicked off back in 2007 with a couple of the first small ones, but they, as you can see, are rather small and not so significant in the greater scheme. Around 2015, 2016, you can imagine which country got interested in floating solar around that time, and you see a large uptake in the installed capacity. And then in 17, 18, it really just started to boom. Once again, largely thanks to China, but also a lot of these other countries in Asia, as you mentioned, Thomas, before, that are really adopting floating solar. So at the end of 2018, there was some 1,300 megawatts of installed capacity. And one interesting thing is just, this is very reminiscent of the real start of that adoption curve. You can see that the first adopters sort of picked it up early, 2015, 2016, you start seeing it taking off. And now you've got these 2 big years where massive capacities have been installed. But I mean, this is just running up now. I think we're going to see a much larger adoption going forward. Our scenarios sort of take this and then extrapolate just based on a year-on-year growth of 10, 20, or 40%. And it's worth noting that historically it's been 30% year-on-year. So this estimates that by 2025 we could see up to 23 gigawatts of installed capacity in the system. That's quite ambitious, but it's not unrealistic. As we'll see, if the costs can get in line, I don't think it's unrealistic. And when you put it into perspective with the ground-mounted market, you can see that there's still only a tiny sliver. Today it's less than 1%, and if the 23 gigawatts was achieved, it's still less than 2% of the forecasted ground-mounted utility-scale solar out there. So it's not big in the grand scheme of solar, but it's definitely a significant amount of floating solar, and there's big potential here. As Thomas mentioned, Asia is definitely running the market. These numbers are from the World Bank report that they did with Solaris. You can see that China has a commanding lead on installed capacity, mostly from just a couple of really large projects. So that's interesting to see. The top 4 countries are all in Asia, and probably expected to be that way. We see a lot of interest in Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia for this, and I wouldn't be surprised to see plants popping up there in the next couple of years, and a couple of new slices appearing on this pie. One other interesting thing to note is on the right graph that more than 200 projects have been installed, and even though quite a lot of them are small, this provides real data from a lot of places around the world that can be used for things like reducing the risk in insurance premiums and convincing banks on the bankability of these systems. So it's good to see that a lot of small projects are out there as well gathering data. I mentioned China, mentioned Asia maintaining its lead, but as Thomas also mentioned, Europe is not to be discounted. There's quite a few large plans being announced here. Holland in particular has announced some very large ones for the next year or two. So yeah, it really is going to be a bit of a global transition. In the news, you'll see puns being thrown around all over the place about floating solar making a splash and all of these sort of things. It's all good, fun and games, but it is sort of spreading the awareness of floating solar as a viable alternative, and it's good for the market, and they're getting more and more pervasive, these articles, which is indicative of the growth that we're seeing. The World Bank analysis concurs that there is big potential. They did an analysis on the man-made reservoirs around the world and found that if only 10% of those were covered with floating solar, then there's over 4 terawatt of potential. They're not suggesting that's sort of what's going to be achieved, but it is definitely an indication of just how much space there is to be utilized. What's sort of driving this potential? What can bring it to fruition? I think one of the main ones is that the costs are reducing because floating solar is very much riding on the back of the ground-mounted solar industry. It achieves the same price reductions in modules and in inverters. All of the benefits that happen there, or most of them, are also applicable to floating solar. So prices are reducing as land constraints continue to rise. People are going to start turning towards the water bodies, of which there are plenty, and if we're able to unlock the offshore market, then it's virtually limitless. Hydro-connected plants are seen as a very attractive frontier, as I'll get to in a bit. One of the potential drawbacks is just a lack of supply of these floaters, which is not really a problem at all. I guess if the demand were to rise that quickly, a lot of these suppliers would be ready to ramp up and achieve the demanded capacities. And so there is definitely scope here to reach the sort of numbers that we've been talking about previously. Down the bottom here is just a quote from Ceres, backing how big they believe that the hydro solar hybrid market is. One second, I'll get to that in a bit. On the challenges side of things, what's been holding it back so far? I should say that a lot of these challenges are things that have been addressed in the last few years, and as you'll see, a couple of the new solutions have made significant progress on this. But a big one has traditionally been logistics. These floaters are essentially just big air bubbles, and they are expensive to transport, especially if the plant isn't going to be nearby the manufacturing, the plant that manufactures the floaters. The Cielete, I guess the older designs, I should say, took up about 18 to 25 containers per megawatt. They've got a new design out soon that is considerably better than that. But yeah, I mean, that just adds massive logistics costs, which is added to the total price, which has been one of the main things holding it back. Soiling, mainly due to bird droppings, or largely due to bird droppings, I should say, is more of an issue than you would think. Birds feel very safe out on these floating plants. They're happy to sit on the top of these modules, having their backs to the sun, and then they cause a lot of soiling, and yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of time and a lot of manpower to wash these off, which have associated costs, and it makes things difficult. Resilience, especially in the offshore market, is still a challenge, but it all essentially comes down to costs. These have traditionally been, 20 to 50%, almost double the price in some cases of the ground-mounted alternatives, and that's been very much a barrier to their adoption. So on that point, I wanted to quickly touch base on what these costs are, and a really interesting thing that I noticed while building this presentation. The Solaris report, they've got a floating testbed in Singapore, and in 2017 they released a report on that they gave a whole bunch of great information. I advise everybody to download that and have a look. But they were estimating a capex of 1.13 US cents or US dollars per watt peak in 2017, and just last year in their analysis with World Bank, that's already dropped down to 73 cents per watt peak, which is just wow. I mean, that's a massive price reduction in 1 year, and is good to see. It's I should note that those two are both based on an estimated 50 megawatt project and a bunch of assumptions that they make, which you can read in their reports. But nevertheless, we see similar numbers when we talk to suppliers and projects. They sort of bottom out at about the 0.8 at the moment. But if they're challenging, which a lot of them are, they can easily balloon up towards $2. And it depends largely on location and the water body characteristics. More specifically, I guess that boils down to logistics and the costs, and the complexity of the design and the anchoring system. That can really blow out of control. The World Bank and Solaris report that I mentioned before gave a nice little recap on investment costs that have been realized. You can see that over the last couple of years they've been a bit all over the place, but last year especially we're starting to see a bit of uniformity, I guess, as things are starting to become standardized, and production is starting to ramp up and getting a bit more predictable. What's driving these price reductions? As I mentioned before, I think I'll skip over this pretty quickly. It's piggybacking on a lot of the same price reductions from the other industries. But the floating structure, I think, has also declined quite significantly. And the main two of these four drivers that are sort of being brought under control are the materials and manufacturing processes. They're getting more efficient and using less materials, and thus being cheaper. And logistics, the designs of these systems are getting more aware of those costs and being designed accordingly. So as all these wedges, start to get smaller and smaller, we're starting to see these declines in price. The LOE as well. I just wanted to show this because it was so interesting. 30% in the 1 year, and already it's starting to get quite attractive, even compared to ground mounted. I guess now it's depending a lot on the location. To sort of summarize what makes a cheap project, if they're larger, small waves, not low salinity, not so much wind loads, fairly constant water level, anchoring is available on the banks. That's much cheaper than seabed anchoring. If you can utilize the nearby infrastructure, if it's nearby, there's a lot of things. But if you can sort of get a project with a sweet spot, then you can get these very low prices. On the contrary, if it takes one or all of these ones on the right hand side, that's where the price starts to creep above $1. And particularly with this anchoring, if you need to go deep, and if if the geotechnics down there are difficult, and the anchoring system can be so expensive that it just ruins the project economics. And also, if you can't use existing infrastructure, well, then you miss one of the good benefits of being able to use floating solar, and that can really cost you as well. And this is sort of what the 3 different examples look like. I mean, I didn't use these examples because I know they costed this much. It's just a visualization of what a nice cheap project might look like. as opposed to a very expensive project. On the OPEX side of things, I think I mentioned a lot of these issues a bit earlier on. Ceres estimated about 1.3%. The World Bank, or the more recent World Bank one, kind of concurs with that, although because the CapEx is much lower, the total amount is a bit lower. They've also gotten rid of this 25 higher than the ground-mounted alternatives in the newer World Bank one. I think this is very project dependent. It depends on whether or not you can use the water for cleaning the modules. If it's a saltwater one or if the water's filthy, obviously you need to bring in your own water in. And it's factors like that, site-dependent factors that will affect the OPEX. But essentially, as they get worked out, I don't see them being more than a few percent higher than the ground-mounted alternatives in a lot of these places. Cleaning 1 to 4 times a year. Insurance slightly higher. I think as the banks and the insurance providers get more familiar with floating solar, premiums and things like that will also start declining. So that's that's that. I'll quickly fly through the competitive landscape. I see I'm about halfway through, and definitely more than halfway through my time. So we see that floating solar is definitely undergoing a technology race, and there has not been a dominant design that has been established yet. There's more than 20 plus systems that we're keeping track of and keeping in touch with at the moment. But that being said, Cielaterra is definitely the market leader by far for now, especially in terms of number of projects and experience with floating solar. But over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of these competitors starting to install megawatt scale projects and getting lots of really valuable experience. So we sort of see this lead getting chipped away at. But these guys were very much the first movers and took a large chunk of the market before anybody else really had the chance to get established. So I've split the competition into more or less 4 segments. You've got floating solar systems based on a single float for a single module, and then they use secondary floats to sort of just clip all of these together. That's like the Cielaterra one. You can also get these pontoon solutions where you have a single large float on top of which you mount the modules, not too dissimilar to what you see on a lot of rooftops in many cases. Then there's the multi-float system, which is similar. You get these big arrays of smaller modular floats that create almost a pontoon or something like that, upon which you float an array of modules. That seems to be the most common one. And then there's this other segment which doesn't really fall into those categories. So Cielaterra, I'm sure most people are familiar with. When you Google floating solar, their photos come up most commonly. This is the design which is sort of most commonly adopted around the world. It's a single float per module. I don't think I need to go too much into the details of this. You can easily find details of this online. And so this is sort of what kicked it off. And you had a lot of designs then following that try to optimize the design to overcome the challenges that I mentioned a few slides earlier. Sunseap have been in the news a lot lately. They have a project in Singapore coming up, and this is their new float design. As you can see already, it's a lot more, I guess, logistics friendly, but it's still one float per module, and then a bunch of these secondary floats sort of clipping them together. ISI floating were quite innovative in their approach to tackle the logistics issue. These ones, how do I say, they're sort of hollow and they stack together like plastic cups. So you can see on the right that they stack very nicely and you can fit a lot more floats per container. And then when you unpack them, as you can see in sort of the top picture, you use the module to cover the hole that's there, and so no water gets in there and they still maintain their buoyancy, and you can make some of them walking parts. And I've seen these guys get a fair bit of traction in the last couple of years, which is great. Sumitomo Mitsui, similar to Cialiter, except they've got a foam on the inside to increase the buoyancy. And I guess if there are any cracks, these ones don't fill up with water and put a burden on the system. Ibiden, they're very similar, and I also believe they have foam on the inside. I believe everybody has these slides, so you can sort of go through and have a better look at these photos on your own time. Solar or Reservoir Solar Company is the first of the pontoon solutions, and you can see it's essentially a large, well, floating structure upon which you have a solution not too dissimilar from roof mounted, and then you clip these together with shackles as so, and then yep, AdTech system is the same. Moss Maritime is a Norwegian company with a lot of experience in the offshore industry. I don't believe they have a prototype yet commissioned, but as we see the offshore sector start to grow, I think we might see these ones increase in adoption purely because of their experience in harsh offshore environments. Swimsol, we're the first to have offshore floating systems. These ones are up in the Maldives. 4C Solar have really tried to minimize, I guess, the amount of plastic that's used per kilowatt peak. And you can see a lot of the tertiary benefits aren't really a part of this design. You know, I don't see it really stopping a lot of evaporation or algae growth and things like that. And they've also, I guess, compromised a little bit on the convenience of cleaning these. I know they need to put planks down so that they can walk across them and sort of have access to the innermost modules here. But you know, on the converse side, they use a lot less plastic, and I guess they're trying to really press down on the capex there. I know they installed a few systems late last year in the megawatt scale, so it'll be interesting to follow up on that one. I'll start going through these a little bit more quickly. I mean, a lot of them have you know, metal structures, a metal substructure of this floating system based on you know, big large drums that give the whole thing buoyancy. And Nemo falls into that category. Current Solar is the same, except they've utilized the dome design. Koen use the corrugated tubes. K2 Systems is another interesting one. I also don't think they have any test beds in operation, but I mean, they're a highly reputable rooftop provider, and they've adapted it only slightly, and now they've got this dome design for floating. That'll be another interesting one to keep an eye on. So well, I'll pause here quickly. This is one of the more, I guess, innovative designs in the fact that it doesn't use a single, you know, it doesn't really fit into any of the above ones. It's got a completely novel floater design based on fish farms, for which Norway also has a lot of experience, and this is a Norwegian company. They use, yeah, the floating ring on the outside, and then they use some membrane which they float along the top, which is strong enough to walk on and to mount the modules on. When it comes to the efficiency gains from cooling the modules, these ones are in direct contact with the membrane, which is in direct contact with the water. And so I would say that this would be at least to the upper end of the floating solar designs that could claim to receive that benefit. But once again, data is still being collected for that, and the degree to which that is to which yields are boosted is still a little bit up in the air. And Solaris is the final sort of interesting one. They've got a ring around the outside, and each of these modules or you know, set of modules can sort of float on its own, and they've got a grid made up of cables that is strung up between this perimeter that they build. And so they've got the cables kind of going through there, and so these float, you know, happily on their own, and that's rather innovative as well, and there's not a lot of designs out like that. But as to which one's dominant, there is still no really clear picture. I guess it'll sort of yeah, it'll come down, the market will sort of come to decide that, I guess, over the next decade or so. on the frontiers of FPV. What we sort of show above, we have sort of classified here in Multiconsult as FPV 1.0. It's sort of these simpler floating solar plants now that are really, they're going to come now under the scrutiny of the market. It's going to be about getting the prices down and about increasing the manufacturing capacity and winning projects. And I feel that FPV 1.0 is about to hit a real explosion in adoption, more so than what we've seen. And then next there's FPV 2.0, which still has some technical challenges to overcome and some things to prove to financiers and insurance companies before they can be widely adoptable and bankable. And that's the solar HPV hybrids and the offshore or the maritime PV, of which some progress is being made. And this is sort of, I guess, where most of our work is here at Multiconsult. On hybridization with hydropower, one of my colleagues has recently started a PhD on this exact topic, looking into the best ways to blend the two and how big of a solar plant you can have, you know, so that they balance, you know, what type of turbines work well at sort of offsetting the variability of PV. All these sort of things are being looked at in his PhD, and so we're all looking forward to a lot of learning there. But essentially, these are attractive because, first of all, you can utilize the existing infrastructure, so you get a lot of cost savings there. There's a lot of you can reduce the seasonal variation of the hydro plant. They have their dry and wet seasons where they get more and less power, and they often correspond nicely with the solar, you know, the sunny seasons and the seasons where you get less solar. So it often increases the, you know, the total utilization of the existing infrastructure in a nice way. They can also support each other nicely on the daily level, where you can use solar, you can export solar throughout the day and save the water for use during the peak times. Increased you know, in general, you can keep the water head level at a more optimal level, I guess, and thus you get more efficient running of the hydro turbines. To a degree, and this is what we looked at in Liberia, you can compensate the variability in solar output with the fast responding turbines. And once again, it depends on so many factors. It really isn't that simple. Some turbines are fantastic at doing this. Other ones are not that much faster reacting than some thermal power plants. And so, but in general, it can be done, and it's especially good for weak grids like we looked at in Liberia. And yeah, I'll move on now. Offshore systems are the other ones that we're really looking at. The key challenges that they're looking at tackling at the moment are things like wave height, saltwater corrosion, and anchoring. And these are technical challenges that I think are already now under control, but it's a matter of making them, you know, economically viable and being able to scale up and do this at, you know, at larger levels. Yeah, I'm already over time, I think, so I'll finalize just by quickly talking about some of the projects that we're most proud of. I did mention that we're, you know, working on a 4 megawatt floating solar tender in the Seychelles in saltwater, so that's a very exciting one to be involved in. Last year we worked on a pre-feasibility study for a HPP solar hybrid, looking at how this HPP can support this solar, and in Liberia with such a weak grid, how the two can not decrease the reliability of electricity there, as well as a few feasibility studies here and there, which I don't have so much time to get into. I think I'll leave it there, but I'll finish by saying thank you again to Thomas and to Solarplaza for the opportunity, and just mentioning to anybody joining in that we'll be at Intersolar next week in Germany. So if anybody's interested in having a chat, feel free to send me an email and we can maybe meet up there. And thank you once again to everybody for joining.
Well, thanks a lot, Simon, for I think a super interesting presentation. And before we go to the Q&A, there are already quite some questions. I once again want to tell the audience to use the question box to send in their questions, and the handout box is to download the presentations. So Simon, a question came in about the soiling. Part of the question was how many times a year do you clean it, and I think you already answered that. But the other part of the question was how do you prevent this? Are there any systems in place, for example, with lasers or anything, to keep those birds away from these systems?
Yeah, so the number of times Sarah's recommended 1 to 4, but it's so site dependent, and it really does depend on whether or not you've got a bird problem or not. I know the Queen Elizabeth II floating solar plant had big bird issues, and the birds were protected, so it's very difficult to control them there. And so cleaning can be much more than 4 times a year, and I guess it's just a cost-benefit analysis depending on how much power they're really taking away from you and how much it costs to clean it. And in regards to how to prevent them, there is definitely a laser system. That's the one I see most commonly out in the market. I hear mixed reviews on the efficacy of that system, but I think the consensus is that it is better than not having it. I'm yet to see a cool bird deterrent system based on drones, which I think would be quite cool. But essentially, there's really not much you can do. Scarecrows and lasers and drones and
yeah, exactly.
Hope
but those drones are not on the market yet, right? For this.
I haven't seen anything designed for floating solar, at least.
Yeah, you just identified a gap in the market. It's nice.
Yeah.
to jump into. And so another question: are you aware of any projects combined with storage around the world? Is it something you already see popping up?
Ooh, not so much. No, I don't think I've seen any combined with storage. I don't see how it would be any more difficult than a ground-mounted one with storage, for example, provided maybe it's not too close to a saltwater environment, or that doesn't have any impact on it. But we haven't seen it yet.
All right, thanks. And then another question, you mentioned the lower temperature and the reflection from the water bodies. Any other factors influencing the generation?
Sorry, what was that first thing you mentioned?
The lower temperature, so the cooling effect of the waters and the reflection from the water are influencing the generation. But anything else that is influencing or setting this apart from ground mounted?
I mean, I guess being that they're out in the middle of a water body, they often don't have like any of the near shadings that are associated with that. But then again, a lot of these reservoirs are in quite mountainous areas, so they often suffer from the far shadings associated with that. I can't think of anything else specifically that benefits this over a ground-mounted system, though.
Okay, that's also an answer, of course. So thanks. And so about the life cycle or the lifetime of a typical system, what do you expect? And are there any data backing this already, or because it of course affects the bankability since a long life cycle isn't proven yet on a large scale?
Yeah, I think a lot of module suppliers are happy to maintain 25-year module warranties. Inverter suppliers as well, I think, are often happy to maintain them warranties, but I guess it depends on, they sort of are a bit more picky and they want to check out the environment and see if there's any saltwater mists and things like that. I think, yeah, they're slightly more difficult to get the warranties on. The floaters, I guess, are the biggest liability. I know Cielo Terra have a 10-year warranty. I believe they have a 10-year warranty, which is probably the most bankable at the moment. Any of the other suppliers, I guess, they haven't been around long enough, and there's not enough surety that they'll be around in 10 years and that causes a little bit of bankability issues. But as to the materials are HDPE, and so there's very little concern that they're going to degrade, even in salt water, over the next 25 years. So technically, I think these plants should be able to live a normal lifetime, but proving this to the banks is still an issue.
Yeah, I see. All right, thanks a lot. And another, you mentioned, of course, the frontiers of connected to hydro dams offshore. Another one might be bifacial modules. Do you see a market there, and is it compatible with FPV?
I mean, no reason that wouldn't be. If bifacial modules get, next to as cheap as regular modules, as I think they will, I don't see why you wouldn't use them. But the albedo and the reflection of water isn't that great, so it's it's not going to be the same sort of boost I think that you would see on land, where you can put reflective coatings on the floor and that sort of stuff. Okay. I don't know if it's going to be as big.
All right, thanks. The quick question coming in: OPEX costs. You mentioned them in your slides. Were they by year?
Yeah.
Okay.
About I think 11 to 15K per kilowatt peak per year.
Okay.
Or megawatt.
Let's see the next question. Who are financial service and insurance companies that are already active in the floating solar market and financing commercial projects? Would you know a couple?
No, that's a good question. I don't really have any good ones off the top of my head, but maybe I can. I would have to look into that, see if my colleagues know.
All right. Another one. What percentage in gain in generation are seen compared to ground-mounted systems? So what is the difference already backed by data, or is there any data backing this?
There's a lot of data. I would keep an eye on Solaris and see what they say, because they're going to be the most sort of reputable source. A lot of these companies have done their own measurements and things like that, and you see up to 10%. I think I've even seen 15% boost or something. I think it is a bit ridiculous. But World Bank and Solaris, in their reports, they consider a 5% and a 10% gain in yield due to the cooling effect of the modules. And I also think that 5% is pretty realistic. And depending on the area, 10% could be quite good as well. And it really does just depend on the difference between the air temperature and the water temperature, which is site dependent. In Singapore, the water temperature is almost as hot as the outdoor temperature anyway. So, it does come down to the site.
Okay, makes sense. And maybe a follow-up on this question: does that impact the life cycle of a PV cell? So this cooling effect, of course, generates higher efficiency, but is then the life cycle immediately shorter, or doesn't this have any impact?
I don't see why it would make it any shorter. I mean, it would definitely last at 25 years, and generally they still last quite a fair bit longer than that. I would think that the cooling effect wouldn't be the cause of it dying prematurely. That would probably be more related to just the exposure out on the water, the different movement with regards to the swells, maybe bird scratches, hailstones, things like that. I think would have a bigger effect on the lifetime than the cooling effect.
All right, that's clear. Thanks. And then a question more, if you could recommend or any study or research done on the impact on wildlife and fishery. Do you know any good places to find more information on this?
Yes, and apologies for not really going into that during the presentation to the listeners. The general consensus is that a lot of these plants have smaller impacts than their ground-mounted counterparts. There are precious few studies that have been done on these, and perhaps I can update the slides that we send out later on with that. That might be an option, but this is only for inland floating solar. I don't think there's been any studies on offshore ones yet.
All right, thanks. Then yeah, definitely we'll make sure the slides are updated with this. And of course, we only had an hour, so we couldn't cover everything. So next question: are you aware of any systems with trackers?
Well, yes, I see some have single axis tracking, but in sort of like the up and down plane, so they rotate, you know, clockwise throughout the course of the day. We've seen that one. You know, a horizontal single axis tracking, I haven't seen, but I foresee that being one of the FPV 2.0 technologies coming up. Yeah, no, I haven't seen any good ones yet.
All right, thanks. And then a question on long-term forecast price for floating solar PV. So besides, of course, the forecast for the PV modules, is there any good forecast available on the systems, or should we then wait for a more dominant design to arise?
I think the latter. I think it's going to kind of follow the ground-mounted system price. So it's going to follow the same sort of price decline, but it's going to be more spread, I think. You'll have some projects being very expensive, some being sort of at the bottom end of the range, and it's going to just be a larger spread than you see on the ground-mounted systems. And that'll be the case, I think, at least until the dominant design has been picked. But even then, yeah, even going beyond that, I think.
All right, thanks. And then a question about snow and a follow-up question about ice. So if, for example, a lake freezes, so a frozen lake, how does that impact the system? What happens to it?
I've only seen one project that's been like that, and it seemed to handle it just perfectly fine. The snow sort of forms around the side, and then it sort of lifts the whole thing up a little bit. And then in the spring, the whole thing slowly thaws, and it just sort of rests itself back on the water. But that was quite a small system, and in a lake where there's no movement. I would say in larger water bodies where you might see cracks appearing in the ice and movement along those cracks, you might get a lot more issues with the anchoring or with the ways that the different floaters connect together. I don't believe there's been any large-scale tests in an environment that freezes.
All right. And any systems that you're aware of that work better with snowy conditions than others, or is there not a system that really differentiates on such a thing?
Well, I guess the bifacial ones would be better in snowy conditions. No, I can't think of any other. Oh, you mean which of the systems that I showed would be better off in a snowy environment?
Yeah.
Is that what we meant?
Yeah. If you could recommend the system for a snowy environment, so basically it comes down to that, I think, the question.
Yeah. I would say that person maybe just contact me directly. I would need a little bit of a time to think about that and why. I can't say I've been asked that one before.
All right. That's your email address is on the screen right now, so expect an email, I guess. That's so before we wrap up, maybe one last question. Is micro cracking a real challenge for PV modules while they float?
Ooh, that's also a really good question. I guess it's a real problem for all modules. Would it be more for floating solar because they move around constantly? I guess it probably would be. So I couldn't be an authority on that, but I could understand why it would be and maybe make a small case for it. But the data really isn't in on it yet.
All right, and thanks a lot. I see we have a lot of questions still unanswered, and if you're all right with it, I would say either reach out to me, I can forward the questions, or reach out to Simon if you have any questions answered. Also, you already mentioned you'll be at Intersolar, and well, given the attendance rate of this webinar and the questions around this, I think a lot of people are very interested in the topic. So Simon, thank you a lot for today's presentation, also for answering many questions. And for doing this webinar with us. I hope you enjoyed it as well. And besides that, I would like to thank the audience for joining us today, for asking all these questions. And one last time, mention our upcoming conference in Amsterdam, the 19th of September. The 18th will be the site visit. Please check out the website, floatingsolarconference.com, for the full program and all the details around it. And then one last thank you to you, Simon. Thanks for a great webinar today.
Thank you back at you. And thank you to all the listeners.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.